Good evening and welcome to our summer celebration. My thanks to Ann and John Doerr, Ann and Tom Friedman for chairing this. Madam Secretary, Mr. Secretary, all the front, all the people in the front row, Mr. Minister. It's great to have you here in what will be an absolutely fascinating conversation. We're going to start with John Doerr interviewing Sal Khan. There's a major transformation happening in this world, the digital transformation. It's been going on for about 30 years, but the really cool thing is Sal Khan is leading the way for having it disrupt K through 12 education, and doing so with Ann Doerr, who is now the chairman of Khan Academy's board, and something we can take a small pride in at the Aspen Institute, because there was a lot of discussion a few years ago about this as it was beginning. They'll be followed after about 45 minutes with Tom Friedman and Henry Paulson discussing the financial crisis of 5 years ago and how we're going to make sure there isn't one 5 years from now. So let me start by welcoming our trustee and our friend, John Doerr.
Hello. Hello. Thank you very much. We're in for a real treat for the next 40 minutes or so. And I'd like to welcome Sal Khan up to the stage with me. Sal, please. Sal is for sure one of our heroes, and I think as you'll quickly see, he's more than that. He's a wonderful, wonderful man who's doing amazing work. And if you turn that down just a little. Sal's Academy, Sal Khan Academy, has taught millions of people, and Forbes calls it the largest school in the world. Bill Gates, just a few feet from here, called Sal a true pioneer. And he's written a new book. If you haven't seen it, we'll get around to talking about this here. It's called The One World Schoolhouse, and I highly recommend that to you. It describes a vision for education that's pretty mind-blowing. So I'm very pleased to be in this conversation with Sal. Just a little over 3 years ago, 36 months ago, he was one man working in a walk-in closet. 12 months before that, Khan Academy was his kind of oddball hobby. He was an intellectually hyperactive hedge fund analyst. Fast forward to today, Khan Academy has more than 85 million users, more than 6 million unique users a month, where 220 million lessons have been learned, over 1 billion exercises have been completed. Pretty mind-blowing for a hyperactive hedge fund dropout who was struggling to make ends meet in his closet. Now, just to put all this in perspective, online education is not entirely new. Harvard began offering online education in 1997. Global spending on education is $3.9 trillion, over $1.3 trillion in the United States. But all's not so sunny. As you know, the U.S. ranks 25th out of 34 developing countries in our math achievements. And there's an even deeper divide. That's that 23% of 15-year-olds, Americans, can't use math in their daily lives. So I want to tell you Sal's story, but I first want to connect to your experience with Khan Academy. A show of hands, please. How many of us here know of Khan Academy? Everyone. Now, keep your hands up if you've completed a Khan Academy lesson. And keep your hands up, please, if you have completed a lesson with your child. And put your hands up now if you have no idea what I'm talking about. I'll tell you what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce, if I can, Sal, a montage that shows excerpts of the Khan Academy curriculum. If you'd roll the first video, please.
We could integrate over the surface, and the notation usually is a capital sigma. All of these interactions are just due to the gravity over interstellar, or almost you could call it intergalactic. This animal's fossils are only found in this area of South America. A nice clean band here. Notice this is an aldehyde, and it's an alcohol. Ours is there 30 million. plus the $20 million from the American manufacturer, they create the Committee of Public Safety, which sounds like a very nice committee.
This is not Eve.
No, Botticelli's portrayed the ancient goddess of love.
This is 6 times 6 times 6, or 216.
I'm told the humidity makes it feel hotter. Why is this?
Excellent question, LeBron.
Let's just like make it 11.
Play with the pendulum and get a feel for how it moves.
Function as a bridge rectifier.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
If this does not blow your mind, then you have no emotion.
So Saul Kahn grew up poor, raised by a single mom in Metairie, Louisiana, whose claim to fame is that that town elected white supremacist David Duke to the state assembly. But Saul's intellectual gifts allowed him to escape that town. National math competitions took him to MIT, where you earned 2 degrees, 2 undergraduate degrees, and a master's degree in 4 years, primarily by skipping classes. Isn't that correct? And was that a harbinger then for the Kahn philosophy of education? So then you went from there to tutoring your cousin Nadia, which led you to YouTube, which led you to quit a very lucrative job in 2009 as a hedge fund analyst with an infant son and your wife, Umama, who had not yet completed her medical career. What did Umama say when you quit?
Yes, and you're talking about my Umama, yes.
Umama,
not my
yes.
mother, yes, but there's No, it was, she had seen it coming for a long time. I mean, you go back to 2004 when I started tutoring my cousins. She saw that that was a kind of a passion that I was building. Word had gotten around in the family that free tutoring was going on, so I found myself with many cousins every day after work, and my wife was observing that. And then, you fast forward a little bit. I started writing software for them to practice, and my wife saw me every day after work, literally, coding this thing together. And at some point, I put a database behind it so I could track my cousins. And then a friend suggested, hey, why don't you put some lessons on YouTube so that it could help you scale up a little bit. My first reaction was, no, that's for cats playing piano. That's not for serious mathematics. But that happened. I did it, and then, long story short, people who are not my cousins were starting to watch, and they started sending letters, and some of them were just, things like, thank you, and I even, and even that was pretty special on YouTube. Most of the comments are not thank you, for anyone who spent much time there. But then we started getting letters, and I literally used to bring my wife over, and I used to say, hey, look, like, this letter is coming in from Wyoming, and it's some parent who's saying that this is getting through to their son who has dyslexia, or it's coming from some person who's leaving the military who wants to go back to college, and this is how they're re-engaging with math. So she was kind of having that adventure with me, and so...
But did she have deep reservations?
Yeah, well, you could imagine she was supportive of this as a hobby.
Yes.
But... And everyone has bad days at work. And, there's a couple of times probably in 2007 especially in 2008, and we'll probably talk more about that in a...
We have the secretary to follow.
where you're like, maybe this other thing's what I meant to do, but then you look at your finances and you say, maybe not yet. But by 2009, it was just, she could tell that this was where my heart was, this was where my mind was. She saw that we were getting traction in terms of users. It was growing every month. She was seeing the letters that we were getting from people.
Did she put you on a budget, a time budget, or a financial budget?
We kind of together decided that let's give it a year. Let's see if in the next year we had about enough savings it was good savings, but it was about a down payment on a house in the area.
About how much?
It was a couple of $100,000, and so we figured like we could live for a year and eat into that, but we realized we couldn't do much more.
So how close did you get to the edge?
I quit my job in fall of 2009, kind of assuming that this is a no-brainer. The social return on investment is just through the roof. We were already at that time, I think, reaching 100,000 students. And but I think like any entrepreneurial, and a lot about entrepreneurial stories, you start off in this very naive point, and you assume it's just going to be a kind of a very easy next few months, and then you start getting rejected and rejected and rejected. And frankly, that kept happening for about 9 months until a couple by the name of the Doers showed up, and things changed a little bit.
So You were drawn to this by experiences with your cousin, right? What did you learn from tutoring Nadia that's informed this work?
Yeah, it's interesting because Nadia, she, by all measures, was a good student. She went to a good school in New Orleans. She, for the most part, was an A student, A minus, every now and then a B student. And so it was pretty shocking to me when I found out when she had visited me right after our wedding in Boston, or actually her mom told me, that Nadia is having trouble in math, and that because of that, she's being placed into a slower math track. And I don't think even her mom fully appreciated all the repercussions that would have. She wouldn't take algebra with the advanced students, and she wouldn't take calculus in high school, then she would have trouble getting into a competitive college. And when I talked to Nadia about it, I asked what's going on, and it was unit conversion. And I said, well, I'm confident that you can understand this, but she was skeptical. But what I realized when I started working with her over the phone is that even this student that the system was saying is, well, on one level she was getting good grades, but then the system is kind of holding back. She had all of these gaps in her knowledge. That just getting A minuses and Bs, well, when you get a B, that's 10% you didn't know, and then the system kind of moves you forward. And at some point, or even with unit conversion, because of this one gap in her knowledge, she was being tracked into her slower track. And so one is the discovery of even good students have these gaps, but then the reality that if you work with someone in a very intense way, we were on the phone every day for a month. Eventually, at first she was just checked out. She thought she was no good at math.
Were you using a computer?
At first we were just using speakerphone, and then we realized that we needed to see writing somehow. So we used Yahoo Doodle, and we used our mice to mouses to write.
Let me go to Khan. I'll check.
And then I. The other day, I wanted to look up something on heart disease,
Yes.
and I do a video search. I was like, oh, this is a good video. I was like, oh, I made this.
How many videos have you? Wait a minute. We're going to get back now. How many videos have you made?
3,500.
And how many of them do you remember?
Well, I remember making all of them, almost all of them. But yes, if you ask me about the details of ischemia right now, I would have to review a little bit.
You did one on the financial system, though, that was very popular, right?
Yes, actually, that's what most people don't realize when people associate the Khan Academy, they tend to think K through 12, and I started with my cousins. But one thing I found myself, as early as 2007, a lot of the junior analysts were, these were people with, 4.0 GPAs from Ivy League schools with econ degrees, with finance degrees. They didn't understand, basic accounting, or they didn't understand, backlog, or how to forward-looking. Yeah. And so I would start making videos for them. This was also during the time that housing prices were going up a lot.
Yes.
I was getting a lot of pressure from family to buy houses because they can only go up. And I started doing a series of videos. It's actually there, and I left them there because it's dated pre-summer of 2008.
Oh, these are vintage.
These are vintage, but it's on the analysis of, I don't understand why the housing prices are going up, salaries aren't going up, population is going up. The only thing that seems to be happening is that lending seems to be getting looser, and I talked a little bit about that circular nature. So those were out there, and then I started having, when I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about it, when the crisis hit, all sorts of people were saying, well, what's a credit default swap? What's a mortgage-backed security?
And all that is explained on Khan Academy.
Yeah, so I started making videos on that, and
Did you know that, or did you learn that?
This was like my actual job at this point. When in the fall of 2008,
Yeah.
I think like a lot of people in the industry, we actually just moved to cash and started reading the Federal Reserve Act over and over and over again. Just trying to understand what is possible, what are the tools at the disposal of the Treasury, what are the tools at the disposal of the Fed.
Hold on. That's your day job. And then by night, you're on Yahoo Doodle with mice with Nadia.
Well, by this point, Khan Academy had already started making the videos. But yeah, I was still working with the cousins as well.
So let's close out the cousin story.
Yeah.
What else did you learn from Nadia that's really important to Khan?
Well, the other thing that I learned is that same young woman who thought that she was no good at math, who thought that unit conversion was just beyond her, if you worked with her really intensely for about a month, she got unit conversion, but then she started to catch up, and then frankly she got a little ahead, and I became something of a tiger cousin at this moment, and I called up her school, and I said, I really think Nadia Rehman should retake that placement test from last year.
Right.
And they said, who are you? I said, I'm her cousin. But that same Nadia, and I'm not complacent yet. I always tell her a lot's riding on her success. But by the same young woman who at the age of 12 thought that she couldn't get unit conversion, by the time she was in 9th grade, was taking calculus at the University of New Orleans.
Wow.
So just a good dramatic.
Congratulations.
The jury's still out on what.
Did she give you any feedback on the learning methods and on the
I mean, never kind of a direct feedback, but it was interesting. I think, the one point that I do remember about a month into it, when something clicked in her head and she realized how easy or simple unit conversion could be if viewed the right way, she wasn't even happy about it. She was almost angry because she felt that this thing that was going to determine her whole future, that was convincing her that she was no good at mathematics, was such a simple thing. And I think that kind of lit a little bit of a fire in her, and that's what drove her after that.
My understanding is, as generous as it was, she really didn't want you teaching her online in real time.
Well, that was a discovery, really. 2004, I started tutoring her, started writing the software. 2 years passed by. We moved out to Silicon Valley. I started tutoring a lot more cousins. And this was when this friend said to make the YouTube videos. And when I put those first few videos out there, I told my cousins, I said, look, these things are out there. It's a little brief explanation of least common multiple or factoring polynomials, whatever it is. Why don't you watch those as a refresher, and then we could use our sessions to go deeper. And after about a couple of months of that, I asked them what they thought, and they somewhat backhandedly told me that they liked me better on YouTube than in person.
And why is that?
Oh, I think it's what you're talking. I mean, I haven't said how broad of a statement that is. I think they enjoy my physical company in some ways, but I think it's this idea that, and we've all experienced this. I mean, even now at Khan Academy, I'll ask an engineer, well, how exactly are we sorting, or how exactly are we recommending the right video or exercise for someone to do? And he'll say, oh, it's really easy, Sal. This is the algorithm. It's blah 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 blah. Right? It's really easy. And I'll be like, yeah, that's really easy. And it's the same thing when you're explaining something. When I tried my best when I was with my cousins to be non-judgmental, to go at whatever pace they wanted. But you got to imagine the pressure they feel when someone says, do you get it? Do you understand it? Who knows where their mind is? Who knows what else they have to do? And so now when they were able to get the videos, they could watch it at midnight.
They're in control.
They're in control. No one's judging them. They could watch it 50 times if they need to.
Terrific. So it's the summer of 2010. Savings are dwindling. Walter Isaacson is interviewing Bill Gates over at the other tent there. You haven't met Bill Gates, and you learn that he's learning your videos, and he's teaching his kids with your videos, and you meet Bill Gates. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, no, this was one of a series of just crazy things that started to happen. I mean, even that day, and it literally happened near here, I was running a little summer camp with middle school kids, and I had 6 kids playing a game of Risk, and then I had the other 20 trading securities based on the outcome of the game of Risk. It's very good. And I'm not making this up. One 7th grader invented naked shorting on his own. Completely. I was like, you're selling something you don't
And that's the
have.
financial naked shorting, not the other kind,
yeah,
right?
No. It was the financial.
I have some teenage. Well, never mind.
Yes. And while that was happening, Anne, your wife, sends me a series of text messages. And she was in, I think, this tent or a tent nearby. And as you said, Walter Isaacson, Bill Gates were on stage. I didn't know about any of this. And Anne says, at Aspen Ideas Festival, in the main pavilion, last 5 minutes, Bill Gates talking about Khan Academy. And so I didn't.
You're kidding.
I was like, is this a prank? Anne didn't really seem like that type of person. And so I immediately boot the nearest 7th grader off of a computer, and I start looking for some proof of this thing that Anne is talking about. And it was later that day, they posted it on the site, first an audio transcript and then a video. And yeah, as you said, it was literally Bill Gates saying that he uses it, himself uses it with his kids. And it was one of those very kind of out-of-body, strange experiences where on some level you're ecstatic. You're like, this is like the best thing that could ever happen. And on another level, you're like, that's scary. These videos were for Nadia, not Bill Gates. And then, frankly, it was just very strange because I didn't know what to do next. Do I call him? What's the protocol here? I'm assuming he's not listed. And they actually left me in that situation for about 2 weeks.
So what did you do?
I did not. I mean, I literally went home. I I told my wife about it, and she didn't really know what to make of it. And I started, but literally the next 2 weeks, I just kind of said, well, I guess this happened. If I'll go back to making videos. And 2 weeks later, I got a call from Seattle, hello? And it was Larry Cohen, Bill Gates' chief of staff, and he says, you might have heard Bill's a fan. Yeah, I heard that. And if you're free in the near future, we would love to fly you up and find out how we can support what you're doing. And I was looking at my calendar for the month, completely blank. And I said, yeah, I got to cut my nails on Wednesday, but other than that, I think I could, meet with Bill Gates. But, yeah.
And how'd the meeting go?
It went well. I mean, we met, and it's strange because I'm telling the story about meeting Bill Gates, who's this iconic person who I grew up kind of idolizing on a lot of levels,
sure.
but I'm also frankly on stage with other folks who are at that. Well, anyway, this is surreal on a lot of levels. But we met, and he asked what up to, and it was just one of those surreal times in your life where 20% of your brain is trying to speak in a cohesive way, and the other 80% is saying, that's Bill Gates. That's Bill Gates. Don't mess up. That's Bill Gates. And you just try to deal with it.
Saul, are you just interested in everything? Do you have a passion for learning?
Yeah, and that's where I think, people often make it like this very huge change that I did going from the hedge fund world into what I do now.
They are different.
In some ways they are different, yes. But the one commonality, and this is what drew me to my previous career, was that job really was about trying to understand the world. The same morning I might talk to the largest egg producer in the country, then a software company, then a biotech firm, then a railroad company, and you're trying to connect the dots between all of them. And obviously that was with the intent of generating alpha or whatever. But the commonality is you got to learn about everything, and I think that is the fun for me, is that now I feel like I do have the best job on the planet, is I go in the morning and I learn new things and I try to communicate it.
So what were you thinking when you left the hedge fund world to do something socially useful?
I didn't even think of it that way. I really liked my old career, and the hedge fund world sometimes gets doesn't have the best branding, but there are some really good actors, and my boss, our portfolio manager, was he was one of the best, ethical, everything else. I credit a lot of the reason why Khan Academy exists to him, because he used to say, look, you need to have a life. We're not about making many decisions, we're about making good decisions. You need to be able to go home, you need to be recharged, you need to spend time with your family. And because of that, I was able to go home and work with my cousins. So I really loved that, and he was an amazing mentor. But this Khan Academy thing it just took over my life. It was, when you get letters from people, if you get even one letter, and Ann knows, she comes to a lot of our company updates, is, we read these letters from people all over the planet.
What's the letter that's moved you the most?
Now we get, it's hard to pick, but in those early days, and this was one of them I would say that was a catalyst for me really quitting, was a letter from a young man, grew up in the South, African American, didn't go to great schools, diagnosed with a learning disability, everyone marginalized him. At some point, I think a little late, he decided to go to community college, and he took it upon himself, because he thought he was bad at math, to look on the web for something, so obviously a very self-motivated individual, and he stumbled on Khan Academy. This was the summer of, I think, 2009, and in August he wrote a letter saying that he just spent the summer on Khan Academy, and he just took the placement exam at the local community college, and he got a perfect score on it, which had never happened at the community college before. And that they immediately said that he has to become a math major, he has to transfer to the local four-year college, and that was kind of a mind-blowing. If just one of those things happened, but and so you can imagine when you see that beats any bonus or anything else. Oh no.
What is the hardest thing about the work that you do, day in, day out?
I feel like I'm living in this is a dream for me. I think the hardest thing is we've gotten to a scale, and we're doing and we could talk more about that, but there's a lot of evidence that this is moving the dial in the right direction. but the problem is so big that we're getting sucked into probably 20 different directions right now. And I think for us, it's really important for us to make sure that we're focused, and we're focused on the most important problems first.
And the most important thing, Jim Barstow would say, keep the main thing the main thing.
And you know, this is for, and you know, and you know this, and you know, you've been an advisor for us as well, is, you know, on some level we're not for profit, but on some level we're also kind of a Silicon Valley tech startup. And
competing for engineers.
We're competing for engineers, we're competing for mind share and everything else. And there's a temptation, you know, and we've debated this in our own organization, you know, as recently as, you know, a couple of days ago. It's like, what's our priority? Is it to get to 100 million users as quickly as possible? Is it to make sure that every school uses us? Or is it to make sure that people are definitively learning in the best possible way on the site? And the one thing that we've come to the conclusion is, I think our role, and I think this is why it's important to be a not-for-profit, because sometimes in the for-profit world, there'll be other forces that might drive you towards growth, because that's going to affect your next round, or that might drive in some other direction. But as a not-for-profit, we're like, no, I actually think, and this is, you know, this is the mindset I had in 2005, where I didn't think that any of this was ever going to happen. I just said, look, let me see if I can make something that genuinely helps my cousins. And so we want to hopefully maintain that the single most important thing that we can do is make something that definitively moves the bar for initially K through 12 math, then later math general, and then later, you know, maybe all of STEM, and then, you know, if we're talking 5-10 years from now, you know, as many subjects as possible.
So let's do some fast facts on Khan. It's a nonprofit. How many people do we have? What's our expense, our budget? What are you going to monetize Khan in some ways? How do you think about all that?
We're right now a little over 40 full-time employees. We have 20 interns. We have like 30 teachers who are helping us make content, and researchers who are running literally cognitive experiments on the site. But 40 full-time.
But 90 all told.
90 all told. Well, actually, we have 14,000 people translating our videos. So in some ways, there's many, many people part of this.
And in how many languages are the videos?
There's been subtitling and translating pretty much in every world language, and I think we even have some examples of that.
Klingon.
What was that?
Klingon.
So, yes. So we've made our site internationalizable,
yes.
And there's a group that started translating it into Klingon. So.
Okay, that's good.
Yes. So no, you were joking, but they are people who take this very seriously.
The internet's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, so right now we're
back to 90 people in 14,000.
Yeah, so we're a little over, I think we're about a 12 million a year annual budget, and you know, the way we see ourselves is, you know, over the next 5 years we're kind of heads down. Let's make sure that we solve that most important problem. Actually, try to move the bar. I mean, you know, you said people. Well, the idea of what we're doing is not new. People, when radio came out, people were like, "Hey, this is going to solve our education problems. We'll put the best lecturers on the radio and disseminate the information." Didn't happen. When TV came out, same thing. When the VCR came out, now it's on demand. When the PC came out, people were like, oh, this is going to be the interactive tool. This is going to be Steve Jobs famously, this is going to be the treadmill for the mind. And, you know, it never really moved the bar. And so our mindset is in the next 5 years, let's get the best possible people to work on the problem, and let's make sure, and we think there already is evidence that it's moved the bar, but let's make it definitive that it's moving the bar. But in terms of sustainability, we do hope to become sustainable in some way. Never compromising the free part we don't want the learning to ever have a wall in front of it, but we are starting to license we've inadvertently kind of started to build a brand in this space.
You have built a brand, I would say so. Yes.
And we look at like, you know, actually Sesame Street has done quite well with Elmo dolls. I don't know if Sal, I would have quite the same. We could call it unibrow. It would be a very. But we are licensing content. You could imagine the tools maybe could somehow be credentialing could be an interesting
all the
space.
while you're a nonprofit.
All while we're a
Sure.
nonprofit.
But monetizable. And you have some global partnerships, right?
Yeah, you know, when all of this started, I mean, as early as fall of 2010, you know, it was in a conversation with Google that they said, well, what would you want where this to go? And I told Google the same things that I told the Gates Foundation. Let's build an interactive platform. Let's have diagnostics. Let's use analytics to actually prove what's working, what's not. And I said, you know, and it also might be pretty cool if we internationalize the site. And so they said, oh, we're intrigued by that. So we started translating the videos 2 years ago, and so that we actually have more videos in other languages than we have in English now. And now we are starting to actually internationalize the platform itself. We're working with the Carlos Slim Foundation in Latin America. In the next really couple of weeks, you're going to see a full, they're helping us translate a lot of the site. You'll see a fully Spanish Khan Academy, everything, videos, exercises. Shortly after that, a fully Brazilian Portuguese Khan Academy. And then Arabic, Hindi, Mandarin, on and on and on.
It's mind-blowing. Tell me this, I'm very interested, is Khan Academy meant to be supplemental or mainstream education? And what's going on in classrooms as a consequence of that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and there's not an easy, I always, whenever someone asks it, I always like go back with the question is if there's a student who is in a formal, let's say, calculus class, but is having trouble understanding the material, but then goes to a supplemental resource and learns the material there, what is, maybe that is more important for that student and one or the other. So I think it's someplace in between. I view us as not somehow competing with the classroom. I see us as competing with the tools for the classroom. So I think we could be a very important core tool for a teacher.
So how does a classroom or a teacher's work change when they're embracing Khan?
So in a traditional model, and the one most of us grew up in, we're grouped by age. You have lecture, homework, lecture, homework, lecture, homework. Homework you're usually doing on your own. A lecture, it's kind of a passive experience.
Tests, quizzes.
Tests. On that test, you get an A, I get a B, you get a 70, a C. And even though that test identifies those gaps in the learning,
sure.
You move on to the next concept. So you didn't know 20% of exponents. Too bad. Let's now move on to negative exponents.
Move right on down.
Move right on down. And the analogy I draw is imagine if we did other things that way, like home building. So you.
What would that be like? I can't quite imagine it.
You bring the contractor in and you say, "I'm told we have 3 weeks to build this foundation. Do what you can," and they do what they can. Maybe it rains. Who knows? Inspector shows up and says, well, the concrete's still wet there. That part's not quite up to code. I'd give it a 80%. And you say, oh, great, that's a C. Let's build the first floor. And then same exact thing. Maybe the workers don't show up. And you keep going. And then all of a sudden, when the whole thing collapses, if your reaction is the reaction we have to education, you say, oh, it was a horrible contractor. Maybe that's part of it, or you say we need more inspection. But what was really broken is just this model. You artificially constrained how long you had to work on something. Then you had an inspection and assessment. You identified gaps, and then you ignored them.
So this is really insightful. What does Khan change about that model?
Well, the model that I just described, and I'm a little bit poking fun of it, it was a necessity. It was a necessity if you go, the late 18th, early 19th century, where it was the first time that industrialized nations started to say, hey, we don't want just the nobility to get their own private tutors. We want to do mass public education, starting in Prussia, then soon in the US and in Japan, and it's no coincidence that these are the powers that really blossomed. But how do you do that in a cost-effective way? Well, it was the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. How do you do anything at scale with reasonable quality? You batch the things together. You have some set, very scientific-seeming process. You kind of spray processes. At some point, you have some product that looks good. These oranges are going to go to Whole Foods. These oranges are going to be squeezed, I guess, for juice. I don't know if that's a good analogy, but
I'm thinking of my daughter.
Oh, okay. But it was the only way to do it. And you fast forward all the way to today, it's what we all grew up in. But the gold standard was always to personalize education, to let people go at their own pace, to master concepts before moving on, to make the classroom not about just information dissemination through a lecture, but to make it problem-solving and interaction-based. But before technology, there was no way to actually do that.
And would you say the world can't afford that?
Well, and the world couldn't have, if you go, the reason why student-to-teacher ratio is such an important ratio in a lot of people's minds is because it's the idea that if you go from 30 to 1 to 20 to 1 to 10 to 1, you can start to move in that direction. But the reality is even 10 to 1, you're still not getting there. It's still kind of everyone moves lockstep. The real gold standard is what the nobility had 400 years ago. You have an army of personal tutors who cater it to your needs. And what's exciting now is that wasn't practical. And there's actually, in my book, I write about studies from the 20s where they did this with worksheets and they got dedicated teachers and the results were incredible, but it just wasn't practical. It was expensive. But that's what computers are good at. They're good at information dissemination. They're good at coordination. They're good at giving people data so that the teacher can walk into a room, not give the same lecture that he or she's been giving, But look at a report, see who's strong at something, let them move ahead, see who needs help, allow students to pair up with each other, get real data on what interventions are actually working versus not working. If 3 kids are having trouble with negative exponents, I'm gonna sit down with them and have a very valuable interaction. And the key thing here is then every moment of a teacher's time isn't spent grading homework, it isn't spent lecturing, it's actually interacting with students. And so what we say, you're optimizing not the student to teacher ratio, you're really optimizing the student to valuable time with the teacher ratio.
Student to valuable time. And then Khan builds a knowledge map that relates these lessons and has criteria to move ahead. What are those? How does this map work, and what are?
Well, it's going back to the I guess the home building analogy. So that was artificially constraining how long you have to learn something and when, and the variable is how well you learned it. A, B, C, D, F. We say, hey, let's do it the other way around. Let's let the variable be, you work on it when you need to, as long as you need, and what's fixed is that everyone learns at a very high standard. There's no reason you should learn basic exponents really, 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 really well before you go on to negative exponents. Otherwise, you'll just get more and more superficial understanding. And so we do it, in some ways it's kind of a natural, it's what you would see in a martial art or learning music is show proficiency in a more basic concept, then we move you forward. We'll have you then do it in a context switching mode. Well, as you keep advancing to more and more advanced concepts, then we'll also make sure that you've retained some of the concepts that you've seen in the past, which is also sometimes missing in a traditional model. So as much as possible, we're trying to make variable the when and how, and the fixed is the standard you're learning at.
This book is at once very clear and aspirational, and I find critical of today's educational system. What do the critics say about your approach and about this book? Is this embraced?
Yeah, there's 2 sides to that. On one level, when all of this was happening in the fall of 2010, and when I was telling you and Ann about Khan Academy, I was telling Bill Gates, when I was telling Google about Khan Academy, I was pitching it as this supplemental resource that maybe one day could be used in schools. And what was surprising was how quickly these tools started getting adopted, first in Los Altos, now in 30,000 classrooms. And so on one level, it's very refreshing for our entire team for how quick this adoption has been. On the other hand, I think the couple of criticisms that we hear, one is, oh, well, this isn't a silver bullet. Like you can't, and that's one we 100% agree with.
No silver bullets.
No silver bullets. We're at the top of the first inning. We're addressing one variable of many. We are starting to see evidence that this is really moving the bar. We've been working in charter schools in Oakland. We've gotten some interesting data from KIPP. We've been working with Los Altos. They've been measuring what's been happening.
And what's all the data and measurements telling you?
It's interesting. So I would have guessed going into this, and this is what everyone assumed, that this is only going to work for the motivated students. Motivated students being, imagining the top 10 or 20% of students. And what we saw, and this was the first pilot in Los Altos in 2010, we did 2 5th grade classrooms, 2 7th grade classrooms. Los Altos is a broadly affluent area. The 2 5th grade classrooms were just the traditional Los Altos demographic. The 2 7th grade classrooms were a remedial math class. And for the most part, these were kids from the other side of the railroad track, so to speak.
They had gaps.
They had huge gaps. They had, many of them were diagnosed with learning disabilities and whatever else. And I was actually nervous about that class. I was like, maybe this won't work, this whole self-paced learning thing. And what was surprising to all of us, and it was a small cohort, we've since run bigger ones, but this was a pretty telling story, the whole distribution moved in the right direction. So it wasn't even the distribution spreading out, the smart kids getting smarter and the slower kids just falling behind. And the other thing that no one had expected is that one kid in that remedial math class, and this had never happened, that they had never seen this, became an advanced student. He had leapfrogged not even average students. He had progressed 3 or 4 grade levels in the span of one interval. It was actually a 6-month period. And when they saw that, and they saw the whole distribution move, and they saw in the 5th grade classrooms that there was also improvement, that's why the district wanted to go district-wide. Since then, Oakland Unity is a charter school. If anyone's interested, if you do a web search for Oakland Unity, you'll see kind of their data on it. But they've been seeing very similar things. And what's been very satisfying for us is it's not just about the test scores. I mean, test scores are what they are. They're objective, so that matters. But what the teacher talks a lot about is that the mindset of the student's changing. In a traditional model, kind of kids sit back, it's passive. They're getting lectured at. What do I do next, teacher? When is this due, et cetera, et cetera. But now it's the student setting the goals. Hey, I want to achieve that. The student gets help from their peers. The teacher is a resource. It's more like a coach. And I point out in the book, why is it that traditionally there tends to be this antagonistic relationship between a student and a teacher, especially say a math teacher, and why is there this camaraderie between the student and a coach? And a coach is making students do harder things. You know, I was on a wrestling team in high school, and the coach will literally say, like, I want you to do 50 push-ups, go up and down those stairs 50 times, and you go, yes, sir. And the math teacher says, okay, guys, I want you to do every other problem between 1 and 10. No, we don't want to do that. and I think the fundamental difference is that you perceive your coach as someone who is with you, preparing you for battle against an intense world, while unfortunately and I don't think this is what teachers want. I think teachers want to be that coach, but there's too often students perceive their teacher as the person who's going to try to hold them back, the gatekeeper, the person who's going to try to flunk them, and that leads to that antagonism. But if you go to a model where the student is setting the goals and the teacher is there to help them achieve their goals, then it goes more to that coach relationship.
And are you seeing the teachers move towards being coaches in the classrooms where what do you do to go into classroom? Do you prep the teachers, or do you just give them the tools and off they go?
It's a, so when
Let's
I say
focus on those teachers.
When I say 30,000 classrooms, it's a huge spectrum of how it's being used. Some teachers, professors will literally just go, day one and, hey, there's this site, khanacademy.org, it might help you. Now let me just progress with the class. Some say it's a supplemental thing, and sign me up as your coach so I can keep track of what you're doing. Some say I'll give you a little bit of extra credit if you do it, while some go all in, and they say, hey, look, this is how we're going to structure the class. You go at your own time and pace. When we come to class, we're all going to work together. We're going to do peer tutoring. I'm going to go from student to student. Those of you who are showing leadership qualities, who know the material, you're going to take on responsibility and start working with other students. So it's the entire spectrum. And I think that last piece is probably the smallest chunk, but it's the one that hopefully as people see more and more examples and they see more and more evidence, and those are the classrooms where we are seeing the dial move the most, that will become more. And it's not going to be overnight. I don't think this is a 5-year thing. I think this is going to be I think in 5 years, this idea of this being the best practice, that you shouldn't give one-pace-fits-all lectures anymore, that you shouldn't just promote someone who kind of didn't understand algebra into pre-calculus, I think that's going to be understood as, yes, one shouldn't do that. I think it'll take some time for people to migrate, for them to kind of give up their 20-year-old lecture notes and say, hey, maybe I'm willing to go to class and let a little bit more chaos, but more personalized chaos happen for the students, be kind of more of a competency-based model. But I think over the next 10 or 15 years, it'll become mainstream.
So what's your vision for Khan Academy in the next 10 to 15 years? Where do you dream, where do you plan it will be?
Well, I think the most important thing for us is we just have to make sure that math is just thoroughly, comprehensively done really, really, really well. As part of that, we're already super focused on implementing the Common Core at a deep level, and we're not doing it for kind of the assumed reasons. I think a lot of publishers might say, oh, the Common Core, 42 states, we got to sell into those 42 states. Let's map our content to it and try to sell it. We're saying, at first we were skeptical. What is this Common Core? Is this real? But then when we saw what they mean, we're like, this is a really good mathematics standard. It's really deep. It's really measuring whether students understand it. And so we say, this is the standard that we want to build for. It's really good that 42 states are going to adopt it. And it's an opportunity for us because when that adoption happens next fall, roughly a year from now, it's going to lead to a lot of confusion. And if we can go out there and give a reference curriculum, if we can give reference tools, if we can get to the point where a teacher can just at any point in his or her class look at a diagnostic and understand how students line up against Common Core standards, or against even other things like
That's
the
powerful.
SAT or APs,
Right.
then that could be a very
So let's move beyond the Common Core to the rest of the world. Is the rest of the world's education system a lot like the U.S. or a lot different? And what does that mean for Khan?
Well, the funny thing is whenever we compare ourselves against the rest of the world, and there's this urgency, et cetera, we're right behind the Estonians in factoring polynomials, which is actually true. We're right behind the Estonians in factoring polynomials. There tends to be this, America's going to lose its primacy and all of that. I'm actually less worried about that because one thing I point out, even though that's happening, the amount of innovation that's happening in America is getting more and more focused or the amount of innovation in the world is getting more and more focused in the U.S.
Yeah.
But the issue at stake is within the U.S. and the globe as a whole, that innovation is happening from a more and more concentrated group of people. And so you worry about equity and you worry about access. So yes, whether we're talking about the U.S. or the rest of the world, that's a very serious push for us. You know, your question about where we want to be in 5 or 10 years, I hope it's in every language, every major subject, provably works. You know, people say, I can't imagine learning subject X without Khan Academy.
How many students?
You know, it's not in our control where the awareness goes, but you know, we're at 6 million unique now. If we get, you know, especially as accessibility improves with mobile and WiMAX and third world countries, you could start imagining it could go into the tens of millions or hundreds of millions. You know, 50 years, who knows? It could be a very large numbers. And there's another element here, and you know, we were talking about it earlier with this, you know, with some of the work that's been happening in Mongolia. There's some incredible kids out there who just need an outlet and who need to be identified. And we're already seeing in the data, look at that kid. She's off the charts. Someone should go talk to them or nurture them.
Why don't you show us that video about Khan globally? Tell us that story.
Oh, yeah. And just as a little bit of a introduction, so this video, one, it shows the translation efforts that are going on. So you'll see what the videos look like in other languages. We actually have 7,000 videos in languages that are not English, but we're also fully internationalizing the site, the exercises, the teacher tools. And what this video ends with, it's this young woman from Mongolia, and I like to show this one because it's like we're living in the middle of a science fiction book. You know, I used to give talks, and like 2 years ago, and say, hey, you know, maybe one day this will be used in Mongolia, and 6 months later, I get that video, and that video is this young girl. Her name is Zaya, and you know, it's just a kind of a thank you video. And I immediately assume, oh, she must be middle class, upper middle class, that she has access to the internet. She speaks English quite well. And then I read the text of her email, and it turns out there was a group of engineers from Cisco Systems who were going out to Mongolia and setting up computer labs in orphanages. And she was at a girls' orphanage. She was one of the orphans, started using Khan Academy, and that by itself was pretty crazy. But then she's 17 years old now. She's now our #1 creator of content in the Mongolian language. So she's, I told her I'd write a recommendation. So oh yeah, well, let's play the video.
तो ये जो है जो ऑब्जर्वर यहाँ कहीं बैठा होगा तो उसको ये इमेज जो है
那个角就是正弦数值对应的角。Мы можем обе стороны разделить на b plus a.
Également sur la dernière leçon, שהנקודה בשאלה. אז למעשה זה רק השינוי בערך y.
و سنگریزه رو ما اگه بدیم به نونوایی چیزی
এখন 2 কার্বন যুক্ত অ্যাসিটাইল CoA উৎপন্ন হয়
Auf der Zahlengerade zeichnen. Hier ist meine Zahlengerade.
Mas é claro que ele fez muitas e muitas e muitas outras coisas importantes.
I'm Zaya from Mongolia. Your videos are so interesting and funny. Make more lessons.
That's beautiful. Thank you. One last topic, Saul. What's your vision for education in 2060, 50 years from now?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think, you know, this Zaya story, and we're starting to get more and more letters like this every day and videos like that every day. It kind of foreshadows the direction we're going. Is that this idea of education? It's historically been the key determinant of the haves and the have-nots. It's historically been very expensive. It's historically been scarce. And what's exciting about what I think, and I definitely think this is the next 50 years. I'm 99% sure. That thing that was very scarce, we can start to give more and more broadly, and it'll be in a much more powerful way than we've ever thought about charity in the past. In the past, when we thought about charity, we always said, what do the middle class have, or what do the upper middle class have? And we're like, okay, well, that's nice, but that's expensive. Let's create a cheap approximation for the kids in India or the kids in Africa, wherever they might be. And what's exciting about this world we're getting into is it won't be the cheap approximation. I mean, we're serious. We will be able to get to a world where literally, I mean, it sounds almost strange saying this, an orphan in Mongolia will be using the exact same tools as Bill Gates' children. And that's... And you know, and I mean, it's just, I read a lot, as you could probably tell, I read a lot of science fiction, and
And I think you're writing some also.
Well, but imagine what happens. I mean, imagine what happens if we can get there. If we can increase the number of people on the planet who understand quantum physics by a factor of 10, the number of people on the planet who are capable of understanding how proteins fold by a factor of 10, we could literally accelerate, every other aspect of what's going on. So I think it could be a very exciting time to live.
Let's summarize this journey, if we can, from a single-parent family in a poor town in Louisiana to MIT to a hedge fund to tutoring your cousin, working out of your closet, quitting your job, and in 3 years, 250 million lessons and a completely new vision for education in the future in this book, One World Schoolhouse. Please join me in congratulating Saul Kahn.
So, Hank, what's it like to be the follow-up act to the Beatles?
Maybe I'll talk about Goldman Sachs.
Let's pick up on that hedge fund point. That was just terrific. And really, seriously, as a segue, you ran one of the world's preeminent investment banks. You were Secretary of the Treasury at this key time. I know a lot of your private interests in education and promoting conservation around the world, but what was your reaction to what you heard from Sal?
I tell you, it was very, like everyone else in this audience, it was very energizing for me because, like so many people, I think that our education system is a disgrace, and it's very easy to be hopeless, feel a bit hopeless. I've been very concerned about disparities in income gap, and as much as I've been very proud of U.S. innovation, in most cases, when I talk to innovators in Silicon Valley, what they're doing is things that are exciting and you got to be for them, but they're destroying jobs. Okay, and industry after industry, the middle is being hollowed out, whether it's business, whether it's engineering, whether it's architecture, whether it's a legal profession. And so I'm wondering, somehow or other, I believe that technology is going to be the answer, but I'm wondering how we deal with this widening gap.
Where will the jobs really come from?
And I'll tell you, this is, to me, so that's why it's actually the most inspiring story I've heard for a while. And frankly, the reason we have our grandchildren with us, and Wendy hated to leave them to fly here today, and the reason my wife is here with me today is because Saul was speaking, and so and so she knew more about him than I did. So I can see now why she wanted to hear him.
Terrific. Well, let's pick up with the Hank Paulson story. Hank, you had an experience that very few people obviously have ever had. You were at the center, the absolute center of a global economic crisis, the biggest economic crisis for our country since the Great Depression. Before you talk about just the technical sides of that and the decisions made, what was it like for you personally, for you and Wendy? Did you not sleep at night? Did you take up drink? Did you? I know that's. I remember a dinner that actually the four of us had in the middle of all of this. But none of us have ever been there to feel that sense of burden and responsibility. And like, if this doesn't go well, history is not going to treat me well. What was that like?
I think this may be hard for some of you to believe, but in many ways you all went through it with me. And I bet most people in this room have gone through a crisis. And so in one sense, this wasn't as different from some of the other crises I'd been through in business as you might expect. Because when you're boiling in oil, it doesn't make much difference if it's 150 degrees or 180 or 190. You know,
it's hot.
It's hot, and you're boiling in oil. So what I found was, but the hardest times for me was when I was engaged in playing offense, I was preoccupied. So the toughest times for me were when I woke up in the middle of the night. I'd go home, I'd go sound asleep immediately. Because in the middle of the night, little problems seem big and big problems seem insurmountable. But in terms of crisis decision making, and I think most of you know this, that in very few instances in any kind of business decision making do you have all the data you'd like. If you do, you're looking in the rearview mirror and it's too late. And so what you're doing is you're trading off taking an action which is imperfect. When you got a big, ugly problem, you never find a perfect, elegant solution. So, which is going to have some known and unknown consequences, but you're trading off taking that decision versus doing nothing and what's going to happen if you do nothing. And so, in one sense, it's easier to get things done. And the biggest thing I had going for me was not my experience in financial markets, but that I'm decisive by nature, and I'm not afraid to change course if I make a mistake. And so you have to be prepared to make decisions quickly, and if the facts or the information changes, you need to be prepared to change. I think the other thing, you learn a lot about the people around you, you know, and there are a couple people here. I mean, I had Bob Steele was right by me, and some other, and people that I'd had an opportunity to work with, some I hadn't had an opportunity to work with before. But it really takes a team. And the interesting thing about the crisis was the things we were working on, you sometimes, unless you were a moron, in which case we didn't want you on the team, you knew that if you succeeded, you weren't going to be a hero, you're going to be criticized. And if you really failed, you were really going to be criticized. You know, if you say to someone, "How would you like to work on the Citigroup rescue?" You know, if you, well, if you, certainly people that had an interest in a political career running for office weren't going to be any good. And so you had to be prepared to do things that were unpopular. But it's not as different. Trust me, the consequences were greater. And I got to tell you, there were times in the middle of the night when I worried about being Andrew Mellon. But for the most part, it just wasn't that different than other crises.
Go back to, you know, I've always felt, Hank, that there's really just two kind of people in the world when you're in a position of responsibility. People who can get stuff done and people who can't.
Well, yeah.
And I'm just sort of curious, the people who were truly helpful to you, what was the common denominator?
Well, these are people, I always said when I looked at leaders, people I admire, the ones I admire are the ones who define their job expansively and run to problems rather than running away. Okay? And I just kept turning to the same group of people over and over again because others, because they knew how to get things done. They weren't afraid to take a risk. They had a strong sense of integrity, and you know, they're action-oriented people. And one of the when President Bush asked me to become Treasury Secretary, I turned it down the first couple of times. And if I'd known what an honor it was going to be, I would have taken it the first time. But one of the things I asked for, stipulated, was that I would be able to pick my team and be able to replace any political appointee regardless of party. And I brought down some people that I knew, people that I'd worked with before and I trusted, and then picked another group of people that I hadn't worked with before, but I spent time with them. I knew they would be good. I mean, one of them was someone who had worked with Condi Rice and came over and was my chief of staff. But these are all people. I looked for two things. First of all, could they get things done? And the other thing I looked for, would they compliment me? Because before I became a CEO, I'd worked with many CEOs, many outstanding leaders, some that weren't as outstanding in government and outside of government. And what I learned was there is no such thing as a perfect leader. The strengths are flip sides of the weakness. Hank is candid, he's indiscreet. Hank is decisive, he's not thoughtful enough. And so the people that succeed are the ones that get the right people around them and that compensate for their weaknesses, and you listen to those people. And if you don't, trust me, in the big jobs, your weaknesses always get uncovered and you fail. So having the right team of people around you. And that team has to be some people that run to problems rather than run away from them.
You've written a book about this period, Hank. So in the context of that book, what was the most interesting conversation, most memorable you had with the president during this crisis?
Well, I had many memorable conversations with him. He was a remarkable man because as I think about it, first of all, I had a year to build a relationship with him before the crisis, a relationship of trust, or it wouldn't have worked, number one. Number two, for the better part of a year, I kept bringing him bad news. And he never was saying what's wrong or he was encouraging me, saying, you're my wartime general. But I would say one of the most, I had many memorable conversations. He was quite accessible. We both were early risers. He'd be in the office quite early. I could always get him before 7. But to me, one of the most memorable conversations was sometime after President Obama was elected, mid to late November, when after we thought we'd stabilized the markets, and then Citigroup came unglued. And we knew we were going to have to do some things over the weekend, or if Citigroup went down, they had this huge institution, multi-trillion dollars, $500 billion of deposits outside of the U.S. that weren't insured. And I was really down. Now, it turns out what we did worked. And he came over to see me at Treasury. I usually went to see him at the White House, and he said, "Are you sleeping?" And I said, "No." and he said, "What are you worried about?" And I think I might have said I'm worried about being Andrew Mellon, et cetera, et cetera. But basically what he said is, "Hank, you should welcome this. You should welcome this. You've been trained for this. That be thankful it's happening." First of all, he said, "We're not. You're not Andrew Mellon. We're Roosevelt Run, and we're doing what needs to be done, and we're going to do what needs to be done to protect the economy." But then he went on to say, "You've been trained for this, and you and I trust each other. We know how to work together. Just think what would happen if it happened at the beginning of an administration where a Treasury Secretary and a president didn't have a working relationship." So that was but that was what George Bush was like.
Let's bring it up to some current moments and some current issues, Hank. Right now we're in QE3, I guess. So we've got the government issuing debt and the Federal Reserve buying it. And as a friend of mine said to me the other day, if it was all that easy, we wouldn't have to have taxes. The government could issue debt and the Federal Reserve could buy it. So therefore, we know that actually what's going on right now is something deeply unnatural. This is not how economies run. Tell me a story, Hank. Tell me how this isn't going to end really badly.
Well, when I was Treasury Secretary, of course, Treasury Secretaries don't comment on monetary policy, and former Treasury secretaries couldn't, but I shouldn't. But I will.
You're former enough.
I will
And
make.
we
some,
won't let it out of this tent.
Yeah. I'll make some comments. First of all, let's look at what happened with the financial crisis. We'd had this huge credit bubble. I think it had been building for decades. So it was a huge credit bubble that burst. And so what did that mean? That meant that not only were institutions over-levered, but the 10 years before it burst, during the bubble years, 97 to 2007, getting back to Sal's point, median family income was flat, but Americans, the consumers, the individual Americans had doubled their borrowing. So what you found were people were borrowing more than they could afford to maintain a standard of living they couldn't afford. So when you have something this massive burst, it is quite extraordinary to begin with today that we've been going through this deleveraging and growing at, it's not acceptable, but growing at roughly 2% a year. And I'm not taking anything away from the administration's stimulus program and some of the other things that have been done, but by and large, for a long time with our federal government gridlocked, the Fed has been the primary game in town. And so I give Ben Bernanke and the Fed a lot of credit for where we are now and how we've been going through this deleveraging. But you heard me say earlier that when you've got big, ugly problems, there's not going to be a neat, elegant solution. And so that some people, and as you've said, interest rates are extraordinarily low, unnaturally low, and some people are addicted to those rates, so there's going to be volatility as we get out of this. Of course, there's going to be volatility. It's distortional. It's benefited borrowers over savers. It's impacted asset prices, including the stock market. So there is, but let's not forget where we are today, and I'm grateful for where we are today, and I'm going to leave it at that.
Okay. But if you're, let me just follow that up just quickly, if I could.
You could follow it up, but you're not getting more from this man.
If I was one of your kids and I came and said, Dad, you ran Goldman Sachs, you ran the Treasury, I've got, X amount of dollars today. I see this huge bubble building up here. What should I do with my money?
I think it's first of all, even when I ran Goldman Sachs, and I see Bob Hurst here and Bob Steele, who worked with me, they know that maybe I did a good job at hiring investors and managing them, but I'm not an investor myself. Mm-hmm. And so I wouldn't take investment advice from me. But I will tell you.
Anyway, and as a dad.
I give my money to John Doerr is what I do. But no, it's a difficult time to figure out where to
Seriously.
put your money. It's a very difficult time because interest rates are going to go up over time. The one thing we know for certain is they can't stay where they are now. Okay, the only question is when and how do they go up?
Timing that.
Do we transition back to that? And the other thing we know when they go up is what it's going to do to the deficit, because just the interest rate on our government debt is going to go up significantly. So, but again, I would just remind everybody here. Look at where we are. Look at what has happened in 5 short years, and we've been growing now for several years now.
Hank, I want to go overseas for a second to a country you know well, travel to a lot, both in your job as Treasury Secretary, as head of Goldman, and as a private citizen, and that's China. So I was in Shanghai about a year ago, September. And for the first time on that visit to China, I heard something that really stuck in my ear and rattled around a lot. I heard from more than one people a version of this. These were from Chinese investors and business people. Make your money and get out. Make your money and get out. I heard people expressing a real lack of optimism about the future. And since then, there's just been a growing litany in the media that China's growth statistics are either untrue or are headed for a fall. Are the wheels on tight in China? Should we be worried about China? Because if China goes from 8% growth to 1% growth, the whole world is going to feel that.
Well, Tom, for some time, I have been saying that China's growth model is running out of steam. And it's a model that is very dependent on investment, very dependent on government investment, very dependent on exports. So there's no doubt that they need to change their growth model, number one. Number two, that reform in China had stalled for some time. Part of that is related to the financial crisis, quite frankly. I mean, because their stimulus plan and some of the things they did there in terms of their lending stimulus and so on, set back their reform plans. But so they've got a lot of work to do, and there's no doubt in my mind there's going to be some bumps in the road. I would point out, though, that the current leadership team is really strong.
Mm-hmm.
Xi Jinping, Li Keqiang, the premier, the whole standing committee. And so the good news is they're committed to reform, and they know what needs to be done. So, but it's very, very hard when you look at all the moving parts to change the model, how to sequence it, the scope, the scale, the timing, the sequence, and then their system, although very, very different from our system, there's still vested interests that oppose reform. And if you look at the problems that we're having, economic problems really are not economic problems, they're government problems. Getting the government to act. And so the key test is going to be what this leadership team is willing to do. And I think there have been some very positive signs in terms that they really are working to change the model, and they're slowing down growth and other things. Now I spend a lot of time there. Most of my activity is at Paulson Institute, which is engagement with China, think and do tank, and really focused on urbanization in China, sustainable urbanization, because that's going to drive economic and environmental outcomes around the globe. And again, here, you've got it right, that the worry on our part shouldn't be, is China going to eat our lunch? Because if China has problems, every one of our problems, whether it's economic or environmental, are going to be tougher to meet. And if we have problems, and our problems have impacted them. And so it's critically important that we find ways to work together. And our government, believe it or not, can help, and it does help, encourage their reformers. Just this bilateral investment treaty that the Bush administration and Chinese leadership announced after their strategic and economic dialogue, as they negotiate that will help the reformers in China do some of the things they need to do. But yes, there are economic problems in China. I tend to be an optimist in terms of China solving their problems longer term, intermediate and longer term. But again, there are going to be some bumps in the road.
Well, we do live in a world now that has really gone from connected to interconnected to interdependent, and when that happens, you get seems to be a very interesting inversion. Not only, well, first of all, your friends can kill you much faster than your enemies, and so that's Also, your rivals falling, like China, is actually much more dangerous than your rivals rising. So let's speak about our friends now, Europe. Is there any hope for Europe?
Oh my gosh, I thought we were going to talk about the financial crisis. I guess we are talking about the financial crisis. I want to talk about 5 years ago. So, yes, Europe, it's interesting to relate it to what we went through. I wrote On the Brink. It was really a story of a crash between politics and markets and economics. Because it happened, just weeks ahead of the U.S. Election, a national election. And I wrote that when politics and markets collide, markets ultimately win. Now you're seeing that writ large in Europe. And so they've got, again, a very strong, leadership at their central bank with Mario Draghi and the ECB, and he's buying time. But the fundamental issues have to be solved by the politicians, right? Because the fundamental issues are the structural issues that aren't sustainable. The monetary union has to become more of a fiscal and a political union, and that's going to take time. And some of these fiscal problems that individual nations have, structural problems, is going to take time. And so while politics is grinding, the politics are grinding there, and they're going to grind slowly. I think this will continue to drag on. It'll drag on for years. And even with their banks, one of the things we did something that hadn't been done before, I think, in history, getting out ahead and recapitalizing the banking system before banks failed. And Europe didn't do that. They nationalized failing banks, and many of their banks still aren't adequately capitalized, so that creates an added issue. But it is, so I think we need to, and you've made very skillfully, as you always do, you've made the point that, China has got challenges, Europe has challenges, which is going to be dragging on for some time. Japan has got structural issues. Brazil has slowed down, all of which is, things are going to create some headwinds and some risks here for us in the United States.
Hank, when you go back to the crisis that you oversaw, what's the one do-over you would ask for? And if it isn't letting Lehman fail, why was that the right decision?
Okay. Well, so I thank you for the decision, for the question, because and I really do, because it's an interesting thing. Despite the fact that Ben Bernanke, Tim Geithner, and I have said over and over again we couldn't find any legal step that we could have taken to save Lehman that would have worked. I think people continue to get the question, and people are skeptical of the question. And so I'll answer that question, and then I'll get to the to sort of the judgment mistakes or lessons learned or whatever for the crisis. Because that one of the things we learned, and Bob Steele was with me at the time with Bear Stearns, which was an investment bank. When it started to go down very quickly, one of the things we learned was there's no loan that would work. A loan from the Fed wouldn't work. They weren't going to make it through the weekend because when an investment bank is in the middle of a run and is failing, what it takes is either a capital injection or a guarantee. And the Fed didn't have any power to do that. So it took J.P. Morgan coming in, filling the capital hole, guaranteeing the trading book. Then the Fed was able to assist that with a loan. So we went out of Bear Stearns weekend knowing that, having looked all around and found there were no emergency powers for dealing with failing investment banks. We had them for banks, but those authorities hadn't changed since the Great Depression. So really, weeks after that, Ben Bernanke and I went in and talked with Barney Frank, who was chairman of the House Financial Services Committee. And we told him what the problem was. we don't have emergency authorities to deal with a failing investment bank. And we got lucky because J.P. Morgan bought Lehman, bought Bear Stearns.
Yeah.
And but we're worried about Lehman, and we don't have the authorities. And Barney told us what we knew was true. He said, you have no chance of getting Congress to act unless you come in here and say that we're naked, we have no authorities to deal with a failing investment bank, and we think one like Lehman is apt to fail. And in that case, it would have gone down the next day. And so that was, so we worked with that. Now, when Lehman was failing, we did everything we could to find a buyer. And if there was a buyer, the buyer could have been assisted for either the private sector or the Fed. We worked to get the private sector to assist that buyer. It turns out that the really only solid buyer was B of A, and they bought Merrill. And instead, and as I look back on it now, we tried very hard to get them to buy Lehman, but if they'd bought Lehman, then Merrill would have gone down because we had AIG, Merrill, and Lehman going down the same weekend. And it would have been worse if Merrill had gone down. And so, because they were bigger. And so, as I think back on the financial crisis, there are many lessons, but the do-overs I have were all communications. I never,
little closer.
I was never ever able to have the American people understand that these bank rescues were not for the bankers, but they were to save our economy, to prevent disaster from occurring. It's very hard to get credit, though, for preventing a disaster people never saw. And then there were a fair number of other communications dilemmas. The judgment errors I made turned out, with 20/20 hindsight, to have been fortuitous, although they were judgment errors. When we went to Congress to get the TARP, although I wanted emergency authorities to put in capital in case you had to nationalize a bank or whatever, we said we were going to buy illiquid assets because these mortgage securities, which couldn't be valued and had losses, were the ones that were creating the losses for the banks. But in the time we were up at Congress, the situation worsened. Before we had TARP pass and rolled out our programs, 6 European nations had to bail out their banks. We'd had Wachovia and WAMU have these serious problems. And so we then changed and had a program which I think was incredibly successful, and it worked, it stabilized the system. It's turned a $46 billion profit for the bank and its insurance company capital program. But that was a judgment error. But if I had thought we had to inject capital, I would have gone forward and said we need that. And I'm not sure Congress would have voted for it. They voted it down the first time. It would have been more difficult for the House Republicans. Same with Fannie and Freddie. As they were literally on the brink. And frankly, I think the most consequential thing we did, which got the least attention, was Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.
Nationalizing them.
Nationalizing it because they're 9 times bigger than Lehman. They're $5.4 trillion of securities spread around the U.S. and the rest of the world. They're issuing $20 billion in the market of debt almost every week. People are treating it like they're government securities, but there's no government guarantee. And when we went to Congress, I said, give us the authority, I really wanted unlimited. The people working with me said, you can't ask for unlimited authority, so we asked for unspecified. And And I defended it, and I really believe this. I defended it by saying, you know, if people think you've got a squirt gun in your pocket, they'll make you take it out. But if they know you've got a bazooka, you may not have to take it out. Well, guess what? I was wrong. The market made us take the bazooka out. We nationalized them. I think because we did that before, you know, can you just imagine what would have happened if we'd had a failed auction for Fannie and Freddie? And those securities lost value in all the financial institutions and around the world, and how that would have rippled through the
China
system.
was holding a lot of those.
Oh, yeah, China, but forget about China.
Yeah.
Just think about the $3.4 trillion in all the community banks in the U.S. and in people's money market funds and all the other things, places where they were. It would have been disastrous. And then, of course, think of what happened to our housing markets if we hadn't had any mortgage market during the crisis. So, but again, if I'd gone to Congress and said, I think we have to nationalize Fannie and Freddie, I doubt they would have approved it. I didn't believe we would have to, because we hadn't. The regulators said they were adequately capitalized. They said they were adequately capitalized. We didn't have anything but the public information. We got in there, found out the facts, and then we moved. And so again, those were judgments, but it's a bit about crisis decision making, because when we were wrong, we changed. But one other major lesson, as I've been thinking about lessons, which tells you a little bit about how much we can rely on regulation. The first meeting I had with President Bush at Camp David in 2006, about a year ago, a little bit less, about 7 years ago, so July of 2007, I was asked to come in and talk about entitlement reform. And I asked if I could talk instead about a financial crisis. And I said, I think we might have a financial crisis coming, although I saw nothing like this. And he said, what would cause it? And I said, I don't know, sir, but after the fact, it'll be obvious, because we've never been able to predict where some of these other crises have come from. And I talked about the derivative market, et cetera. I didn't see housing. And the reason I didn't see housing was because residential home prices in the U.S. had essentially gone up nationwide. There hadn't been a big nationwide decline ever since World War II, because we had policies where we stimulated residential home buying, home ownership. If you owned a residential mortgage, the biggest risk wasn't that you wouldn't get your money back. The biggest risk was you'd get it back too soon, because if rates dropped, home buyers would refinance. So I hadn't predicted that, but when we started working, and Bob Steele here was working with me with the President's Working Group on Financial Markets, we looked at every risk we could think of. We looked at hedge funds, we looked at the interconnectivity with big banks, we looked at derivatives. We never once looked at the shadow banking market. We never once looked at money market funds where there was a big risk, or the over-the-counter derivative market. Now, I can blame that on the fact that we had this bifurcated, outmoded regulatory system. But another way of looking at it is, if people that were really experienced, spent a lot of time in financial markets, a lot of smart regulators, weren't able to find the problems, I don't think we can ever count totally on regulators being able to uncover problems ahead of time.
Well, Hank, to conclude, I think that President Bush was right. You were trained and born for this crisis. And one thing we know, there will be another crisis down the road. And I think we can say safely that the Treasury Secretary, when that happens, is going to turn to his president and say, I want to be the Hank Paulson of this crisis, not the Andrew Mellon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Real pleasure.